Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film as we take a few moments to look at the worksheet that accompanied the documentary series, The Revolutions episode, The End Game. As a documentary, it's largely accurate. There are not really many things to take a look at. I do want to emphasize a few. Number 3 points out that Congress cannot pay the Army because they do not have the power to tax. And that was certainly true. At first, the Second Continental Congress was kind of making things up as they went along with no written framework for government. Even once such a framework was created, as the Articles of Confederation, adopted later in 1781, Congress still did not have the power to force states to pay taxes. It could request money from the states, shared out approximately based on the population of the states. Each state then would decide how to raise that money, although sometimes they didn't. Congress typically got about 1/6 of the money they requested, making it hard for them to pay their soldiers or supply them or cover their other bills. Indeed, that weakness of being unable to tax is one thing that would lead to the creation of the U.S. Constitution in 1787 to create a government with the power to tax and, in general, to enforce its will. Number 27 mentions Washington visiting his estate of Mount Vernon. Of course, that is famous as his home. It had originally belonged, though, to his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who had served as a Marine during the War of Jenkins' Ear in the early 1740s. He'd served on the flagship of the British admiral in the Caribbean, Admiral Edward Vernon, and named his estate in honor of Admiral Vernon, who was a great hero of that war. But Admiral Vernon also gave the Royal Navy an important tradition. Now, prior to 1740, British sailors were given a pint of rum every day. And they'd often drink it all at once and get drunk. They were supposed to space it out over the day, but you have a pint of rum, why not chug it? Or they would save their pints till they had several pints or a gallon or two and then have a real party and definitely be too drunk to work. And so Admiral Vernon began diluting their rum. They still got the same amount of rum, but it was diluted 1 pint of rum to a gallon of water. That made it harder to store. It weakened it a bit, so it was harder to get drunk anyway. Admiral Vernon tended to wear a type of coat made of cloth called grogram, which today is mostly used for ribbons, also known as grosgrain or a similar ribbon cloth. He liked this bumpy grogram cloth better than more expensive cloth. But people kind of made fun a bit of him wearing this cheap cloth coat, or grogram, and called him Old Grog. And that mixture of rum and water came to be known as grog, and would be one of the most important traditions of the Royal Navy for 2 centuries or more. Number 37 mentions Cornwallis claiming to be too sick to attend the surrender ceremony when 7,000 of his men laid down their weapons. In fact, he was simply embarrassed at the notion of having to surrender to an American general he considered his inferior. So he sent his second-in-command, Charles O'Hare. He also did not want to surrender to an American general, and at first offered Cornwallis' sword to the French commander, General Rochambeau. He just pointed to Washington, so O'Hare offered him the sword, but Washington wasn't going to take the insult of getting the sword from a subordinate of Cornwallis. So instead, he had Benjamin Lincoln take the sword. Washington personally was pretty irritated at Lincoln because he had surrendered at Charlestown, and Washington thought he shouldn't have. But Lincoln had recently been exchanged and was back with Washington's army, and so having this man, who had been humiliated by having to surrender to the British, accept Cornwallis' sword when he surrendered, was meant as an insult to the British, in exchange for those they had offered to Washington. And number 38 is true. Washington's son, Jackie, fell ill with camp fever, which could mean lots of miscellaneous diseases you could pick up in an unsanitary army camp, and died shortly afterwards. Now, this is slightly inaccurate. It was actually Washington's stepson, Jackie, Washington himself was probably sterile. He had gotten smallpox in 1751, and he may have been the father of his country, but does not seem to have been the father of anyone else. Again, by his wife Martha and her first husband, he had a stepson and a stepdaughter, also named Martha, but nicknamed Patsy. As possible, it was Martha Washington, Washington's wife, who was sterile. She had a very difficult birth with her fourth child. It may well have left her sterile. In any case, Martha Washington inherited a fortune from her first husband, which she managed very well, and Washington continued to manage well after they married. Again, by which point she had just 2 surviving children, which Washington raised as his own, even though Jackie was kind of a loser. He made a lot of bad financial decisions as a young adult. He did serve in the House of Burgesses, but he wasn't actually a very good Burgess, and often didn't even show up. Washington said if he didn't know enough to be a good Burgess, he could at least try to show up on time. So he was kind of a disappointment. He was trying to make up for that by serving with his stepfather in the army. But again, he fell ill, probably from typhus or dysentery, and died there in camp at Yorktown. He did manage to have 7 children before he died, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. Most of his land had to be sold off to pay his numerous debts, but part of his estate, through one of his children, eventually ended up in the hands of Robert E. Lee, who married one of Jackie's descendants. Of course, during the Civil War, Lee's estate was seized by the U.S. Army, and part of his estate at Arlington is today Arlington National Cemetery.